I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ramesses Cleland, Permanent Secretary of Ghana.
Mr. President, Minister of External Affairs of India, I begin by congratulating you and the delegation of India on your presidency of the Security Council for the month of December. We welcome the focus of today's open debate and support its intention to reinforce discussions on the kind of orientation required to realize the much-anticipated reform of the multilateral system. We thank the Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, for the depth and clarity of his statement, as well as His Excellency Shaba Kirosi, President of the General Assembly, for his insightful remarks. Mr. President, 77 years ago, the founding fathers of the United Nations bequeathed to us a multilateral system which was designed to ensure global peace and stability. This system was anchored on the absolute prohibition of the unjustified use of force, as well as the search to realize the aspirations of a more interdependent world. When we look across history, we see over the years the coordinated efforts that have been made for the maintenance of international peace and security, the promotion of international rule of law, and the prevention of a calamitous world war. We can only conclude that the founders were right in their ambitions and largely justified in their tireless efforts in San Francisco. However, we are also not oblivious to the fact that the nature and frequency of global crises in the post-1945 era have evolved. Today, we are witnesses to complex, interacting, and reinforcing crises that range from sharp geopolitical differences, the escalated risk of nuclear weapons, increasing asymmetrical and transnational conflicts, widespread and systematic violation of human rights, debilitating pandemics, and the adverse effect of climate change on food systems, livelihoods, and the general management of societies. The challenges of the present era underpin the need for comprehensive and integrated reform of all the pillars of the multilateral system, especially the peace and security architecture, as well as the development and financial systems. We will indeed be remiss if we should lose sight of the fact that inadequacies in one pillar will certainly have consequences for the overall effective functioning of the multilateral system. Mr. President, while reforms in themselves are not an end in themselves, they are often necessary catalysts for calibrating a better approach to collectively realize the objectives we seek. It is therefore not surprising that over the 3 decades of frustrating discussions on the reform of the United Nations Security Council, there have been several calls for global solidarity to ensure an early reform of this noble institution. The most notable recent call was that made by our heads of state and governments in the 75th anniversary political declaration for us to instill new life into the reform process of the Security Council under the aegis of the intergovernmental negotiations process. In recalling the convergence of this global aspiration, we also reiterate the call by President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo to this council a few weeks ago on the need, I quote, to revisit the vexed issue of the reform of the United Nations system, especially the Security Council, and to do so on the basis of the African Common Position on UN reform as enunciated in the Azowini Consensus. If indeed the authority of this council, which in recent times appears to have been devalued because of its anachronistic structure, is to be restored. End of quotes. Ghana believes that the conversations around the reform of the Security Council must necessarily be underpinned by the imperatives of Africa's arguments, which is the only continent without a permanent membership of this council. The historical injustice to the 54 member states of Africa, with a population of more than 1.3 billion and a combined economy in excess of $3.5 trillion must be prioritized. Africa, like all those that hold permanent membership of this council, while even under colonial domination, played a veritable role in the successful end of the Second World War in resources and the several lives sacrificed. We are encouraged by the positive statements by several world leaders at the recent high-level week of the General Assembly and urge that the process of reform must yield real changes to the structure and practices of the Council across the 5 clusters of reform under discussion in the IGN process in an effort to make it innovative in its approach. We also welcome the Secretary General's report on our common agenda, including a new agenda for peace. And we believe a good faith engagement by member states on these proposals could help bring about a new orientation in the nation focus of the peace architecture. It is important that a reformed Security Council aspires to operate differently, and we must avoid putting old wine in new wineskins and vice versa. Mr. President, there were many assumptions underpinning the multilateral system, which today do not hold. In seeking new orientations for a reformed multilateralism, therefore, we should be cognizant of the assumptions we establish as basis for reforms. In this regard, we need to acknowledge that the challenges of today are beyond the reach of any few powerful countries to resolve. It requires a shared responsibility and a common understanding for their resolution. We therefore believe that the General Assembly, which is the most representative organ of the UN, should be made to find new space in the reform agenda, and regional arrangements which were envisaged under Chapter 8 of the Charter as effective collaborators of the collective security mechanism would need to be worked with more closely than ever before. For instance, we cannot attempt any legitimate resolution of terrorism on the African continent without the collaboration of institutions of the African Union and regional economic communities such as ECOWAS. Also, emerging threats and a clarified understanding of the impact of other crises on peace and security imply that a reformed multilateralism would need to embrace an integrated approach to peace and security that accommodates the linkages from climate change, global public health emergencies, and financial meltdowns. Furthermore, a renewed multilateral system should take into consideration several of the international developmental institutions and processes outside the UN, including the Bretton Woods institutions that are failing to adequately respond to the pressing needs of the peoples of the world, especially those of the developing world. When there is a global financial and food crisis, as we are presently experiencing, it should be expected that further down the road, there would be greater manifestations of socio-political instability, diminished capacity for conflict management, and further conflicts. Mr. President, in concluding, therefore, Ghana believes that a holistic renewal of multilateralism characterized by the inclusion of new concepts across the pillars of the work of the United Nations is necessary to get us much closer to having multilateralism work for all and not only for a few. Time is not on our side, and we need to act now. I thank you.